They underestimated her the moment they saw her, and that was the first mistake. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It happened quietly, the way it usually does. A quick glance. A mental shortcut. She didn't look like a threat to them. She wasn't trying to be. She wasn't wearing anything that screamed authority or toughness. No uniform. No sharp posture meant to warn people off. Just a woman going about her day, minding her own business, existing in a space they already believed belonged to them. That's how underestimation works most of the time. It's subtle. People don't even realize they're doing it. They see gender, size, tone of voice, body language, and they start filling in the blanks with whatever story feels comfortable. Weak, untrained, harmless, someone who won't push back, someone who'll apologize even when they're not wrong. They mistook calm for softness. Her relaxed posture read as passive to them. The fact that she didn't react right away made them bolder. When people think they're dealing with someone powerless, they tend to test boundaries faster. A comment here, a step too close, a raised voice. They assumed she'd fold because that's what they'd seen before, because experience had taught them that people who look like her usually do. What they didn't see was what calm actually meant. Calm wasn't confusion or fear. Calm was control. It was someone who had learned a long time ago that reacting too quickly gives away leverage. She had been trained to assess before acting, to notice who was talking, who was posturing, who was actually dangerous, and who was just loud. While they were puffing themselves up, she was already mapping the situation in her head. Underestimation often comes from needing to feel superior. They needed to believe they had the upper hand, because the alternative would mean questioning themselves. So they leaned harder into it. They talked down to her. They tried to embarrass her. They wanted a reaction that would confirm the story they'd already written about her. But the thing about assumptions is that they don't change reality. They only change how prepared you are for it. Every move they made was based on the idea that she didn't know how to handle confrontation. Every word they chose assumed she didn't understand risk. They were playing checkers against someone trained in a completely different game. She'd been underestimated before. Plenty of times. In training. In rooms full of people who thought they knew better. She'd learned that there's no need to correct people when they underestimate you. In fact, it often works in your favor. It buys time. It lowers their guard. It makes them sloppy. They thought strength had to look a certain way. Loud. Aggressive. Obvious. They didn't recognize the kind that stays quiet until it's needed. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that has nothing to prove to strangers. Their voices got sharper. Their body language got looser, careless. They started saying things they wouldn't have said if they believed she could handle herself. That's what underestimation does. It makes people reckless. It convinces them there are no consequences. All the while, she stayed exactly where she was. Not shrinking, not escalating. Just watching, listening, letting them show her who they were. She didn't need to dominate the space to own it. She already understood it better than they did. They assumed she was alone in this, that she didn't have the skills or the confidence to stand her ground. They assumed wrong because they were focused on the surface. They never asked themselves what kind of experiences teach someone to stay that steady when things get tense. They never wondered why she wasn't rattled. They never considered that the quiet ones are often quiet because they've already survived worse. By the time they realized something was off, it wasn't because she changed. It was because their assumptions started collapsing under their own weight. The picture they'd painted of her didn't match the reality standing in front of them. And once that doubt crept in, they didn't know how to adjust, because they had built their entire approach on the idea that she was someone they could push around, someone who wouldn't know what to do when challenged, someone who could be controlled simply by raising their voice and leaning in, never imagining that underestimating her wasn't just insulting. It was dangerous, because it meant they were stepping closer without understanding who they were really dealing with, or how quickly a situation can shift when the person you thought was harmless has been trained to recognize the exact moment when things stop being a misunderstanding and start becoming a threat. She never announced who she was or what she could do. There was no introduction, no warning, no hint dropped to make herself seem important. That wasn't an accident. Real confidence doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to be loud to feel real. She had learned that early on, long before this moment, long before these people crossed her path. Some people mistake silence for insecurity. They think if someone doesn't speak up right away, it means they don't have anything worth saying. They confuse restraint with weakness because they've never learned the difference between confidence and noise. To them, power has to be visible. It has to flex. It has to take up space and demand attention. Her confidence worked differently. It stayed internal. It showed up in how she stood, how she breathed, how she didn't rush to explain herself. She didn't need to assert dominance because she wasn't competing. She wasn't there to win an argument or prove a point. She knew exactly who she was, and that knowledge didn't disappear just because someone tried to challenge her. Announcing power is often a sign of insecurity. People who feel the need to tell you how strong they are usually aren't. They rely on intimidation because they don't trust their ability to handle what comes next. She didn't need that crutch. She had been trained to let situations unfold, to gather information before acting, to understand that the strongest position is often the one that looks unremarkable. She didn't correct their assumptions because correcting them would have been unnecessary. It would have shifted the focus onto her, turned the moment into a performance. She had nothing to gain from that. Confidence allowed her to stay grounded while others grew louder. It gave her patience. It gave her clarity. It allowed her to choose when, or if, to engage. There's a difference between confidence and ego, and she lived in that space comfortably. Ego needs to be fed. Confidence is self-sustaining. Ego reacts emotionally. Confidence stays measured. Ego wants recognition. Confidence doesn't care if it's seen at all. She didn't need them to know her background to feel secure in it. Her calm unsettled them more than any aggressive response would have. They didn't know how to handle someone who wasn't playing by their rules. Every insult, every attempt to provoke her slid off without effect. Not because she didn't hear them, but because she chose not to carry their words. That kind of restraint isn't passive. It's intentional. She understood that power revealed too early can be wasted. Once people know what you're capable of, they adjust. They retreat. They put up defenses. Keeping that knowledge to herself kept the situation honest. It let her see who they really were without masks, without caution, without strategy. Confidence gave her the ability to wait. They kept escalating because they thought they were in control. They believed they were setting the tone, leading the interaction. Meanwhile, she was the only one actually grounded in reality. She wasn't acting from emotion or pride. She was observing, deciding, remaining steady while they burned energy trying to dominate a moment that didn't need domination. She didn't need to say, "I can handle this." She knew she could. She didn't need to threaten or warn. She trusted her training and her judgment. That trust showed in the smallest details. The way she didn't fidget. The way her voice stayed level. The way she met their eyes without challenge or submission. Confidence without announcing power often gets overlooked, but it's the kind that lasts. It doesn't rise and fall with other people's reactions. It doesn't depend on fear or approval. It exists quietly, waiting until it's necessary. She carried it with her the way others carry weapons, unseen but ready, not to intimidate, not to impress, but because she knew that if things shifted, if the situation demanded more than words, she wouldn't need to explain herself or justify her actions or pause to convince anyone of her capability, because confidence like that isn't something you show. It's something you rely on when everything else falls away and the noise fades, and all that's left is the moment itself and the person who knows exactly how to move within it. While they grew louder and more aggressive, she did the opposite. She slowed down, not because she was unsure, but because she understood something they didn't. Escalation feeds on reaction. The more emotion you throw into a tense situation, the faster it spins out of control. She had been trained to recognize that pattern and interrupt it by refusing to match their energy. Staying calm isn't about being detached or cold. It's about staying present. She was fully aware of what was happening, every word, every shift in tone, every movement. Calm gave her a wider field of vision. While they fixated on dominating the moment, she was tracking details, reading intentions, measuring distance, noting who was posturing and who was actually dangerous. They mistook her calm for indifference. They thought she didn't care, and that misread pushed them further. People often escalate when they feel ignored. They raise their voices, exaggerate their authority, hoping to force a reaction. She gave them none of that. Her calm wasn't silence. It was control. Her breathing stayed steady even as theirs became shallow and sharp. That wasn't accidental. She knew how to regulate her body under stress. She had practiced it until it became instinct. Calm starts internally before it shows externally. When your body isn't panicking, your mind stays clear. When your mind stays clear, you make better decisions. They were reacting to her presence emotionally. She was responding to their behavior strategically. That difference mattered. Emotional reactions are predictable. Strategic responses are not. Every time they tried to provoke her, they revealed more about themselves. They showed impatience. They showed insecurity. They showed a lack of discipline. Calm allowed her to let them expose their weaknesses without lifting a finger. Staying calm also meant she didn't take anything personally. Their words weren't about her. They were about control, about asserting dominance in a space they thought they owned. Once you understand that, insults lose their power. You stop needing to defend your identity and start focusing on the situation itself. The tension kept rising, but she didn't ride it upward. She stayed grounded. Calm doesn't mean the absence of intensity. It means choosing where that intensity goes. She kept it contained, ready, focused. The difference between panic and readiness is direction. Panic scatters energy. Readiness concentrates it. They couldn't read her, and that made them uncomfortable. Humans are wired to look for cues. Raised voices, defensive gestures, signs of fear. She gave them none. Her stillness created uncertainty. They didn't know if they were winning or losing. They didn't know how far they could push. That uncertainty worked against them. While they escalated verbally, she de-escalated internally. She didn't let their urgency become hers. She stayed on her timeline. Calm let her decide when to speak and when to remain silent. It let her choose responses instead of blurting out reactions she'd regret. Her calm also protected the people around her. Escalation spreads. One raised voice can pull others into a conflict. By not amplifying the tension, she limited how far it traveled. She kept the situation contained, even as it pressed against the edges. She had learned that calm under pressure isn't something you improvise. It's something you practice long before you need it. In high-stress environments, panic is contagious. Calm is too. Her presence alone started shifting the dynamic. The louder they got, the more obvious it became that she wasn't following their script. They tried to rush her into a mistake. Urgency is a common tactic. Push someone to respond quickly, and they're more likely to slip. She didn't take the bait. She allowed pauses. She let silence stretch. Silence, when used intentionally, can be disarming. It forces the other person to fill the space, often with more words than they should offer. Staying calm while others escalate is a form of quiet resistance. It denies them the reaction they're seeking. It keeps you in control of yourself, even when you can't control them. She wasn't suppressing fear. She was managing it, acknowledging it without letting it drive her behavior. As the situation tightened, her calm became a line they couldn't cross without consequences. They sensed it, even if they didn't understand it. There's a difference between someone who is calm because they're overwhelmed and someone who is calm because they're capable. One feels fragile. The other feels solid. They had expected chaos. They had expected emotional volatility. Instead, they were met with composure that didn't bend under pressure. That composure wasn't accidental or performative. It was built from repetition, from exposure to far worse scenarios, from knowing exactly what escalation leads to and refusing to walk that path unless it became absolutely necessary. Because calm, when held with intention, isn't passive. It's a deliberate stance that keeps options open, preserves clarity, and ensures that if the moment demands action, it comes from choice rather than impulse. Pressure has a way of stripping people down to what they actually know. When things are easy, anyone can appear confident, controlled, capable. When tension rises, when voices sharpen and space feels tighter, habits take over. Training doesn't show in calm environments. It shows when something starts to go wrong. That's where the difference became clear. They were improvising. She wasn't. Everything about how she moved under pressure had been practiced long before this moment. Not in theory, not in conversation, in repetition, in situations where mistakes had consequences. When stress hit, her body didn't freeze or flail. It followed patterns that had been carved in through discipline and experience. Training creates default responses. Under pressure, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall back on what you've rehearsed. She didn't need to think about staying aware or managing fear. Those things had been drilled into her until they were automatic. While others reacted emotionally, she operated from muscle memory and habit. They started showing cracks as the pressure increased. Voices rose. Movements became exaggerated. Attention narrowed. Stress does that. It makes people sloppy. It pulls focus inward. She noticed it all because her training had taught her to widen her awareness, not shrink it. She saw how one of them kept glancing around, how another stepped too close without realizing it, how their coordination broke down as frustration replaced strategy. Her posture didn't change much, but the meaning behind it did. It wasn't casual anymore. It was balanced. Ready. Small adjustments that most people wouldn't notice signaled a shift from observation to preparation. Training teaches you to prepare quietly, without announcing it, without triggering unnecessary escalation. She didn't rush to assert control. Training had taught her patience. You don't act just because you can. You act because you must. Every second she waited gave her more information. Who was bluffing? Who was emotional? Who might actually follow through? Pressure reveals intent faster than words ever could. They were burning energy, trying to intimidate. She conserved hers. Training had taught her efficiency. Don't waste movement. Don't waste words. Don't waste attention. Under pressure, efficiency is everything. It keeps you ahead while others exhaust themselves. Her awareness extended beyond the people confronting her. She tracked the environment. Exits, obstacles, distance. Training turns space into something you read instinctively. While they saw a confrontation, she saw a layout. That awareness didn't look dramatic, but it mattered more than anything they were doing. As the situation tightened, her reactions stayed precise. No unnecessary gestures. No defensive flinching. Pressure didn't speed her up. It slowed her down just enough to keep her in control. That's what training does. It teaches you to move at the pace that serves you, not the pace imposed by chaos. They mistook their aggression for dominance. Training had taught her the difference. Dominance is noisy. Control is quiet. Under pressure, control wins. She didn't need to overpower them in the moment. She needed to be ready for the moment when things crossed a line. Stress reveals what people rely on. They relied on intimidation. She relied on preparation. They relied on emotion. She relied on structure. Training gave her a framework to operate within even when uncertainty closed in. There was no visible countdown, no dramatic shift, but internally, she was running through contingencies. If this happened, then that. If someone moved here, she adjusted there. Training had taught her to think in sequences instead of panic. Pressure didn't overwhelm her because she had already faced it in controlled environments far worse than this. They were reacting to the pressure she represented without realizing it. Her steadiness unsettled them. It forced them to confront their own lack of control. The harder they pushed, the clearer it became that they were losing coherence. Training doesn't make you fearless. It makes you functional. Fear still exists, but it doesn't run the show. She acknowledged it, used it to stay sharp, and kept moving forward mentally while staying still physically. That balance is learned, not instinctive. As the moment stretched, the gap between trained and untrained behavior widened. They became more predictable. She became more prepared. Pressure didn't reveal some hidden strength. It revealed what had been built all along, through repetition, discipline, and an understanding that when things go wrong, when the unexpected happens, when emotions spike and plans fall apart, the person who is trained for pressure doesn't need to announce it or prove it, because it shows in every controlled movement, every measured pause, every decision made without hesitation, every choice rooted in readiness rather than impulse the moment their assumptions started to fall apart wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come with an obvious trigger. It crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly, as small inconsistencies piled up and refused to make sense. The version of her they had invented no longer fit what was happening in front of them, and that mismatch unsettled them more than open defiance ever could. They had expected fear by now, maybe anger. At the very least, some visible sign that they were getting under her skin. Instead, she stayed steady. Too steady. Her reactions didn't line up with the role they had assigned her. When they raised their voices, she didn't flinch. When they leaned in, she didn't retreat. That's when doubt first slipped in, quiet but persistent. Assumptions only work as long as reality cooperates. Once it stops, people don't know where to stand. They had built their confidence on the idea that they understood the situation, that they had read her correctly from the start. When that certainty cracked, it took their footing with it. They began to hesitate. Not enough to back down, but enough to lose momentum. Words came out slower. Movements became less synchronized. One of them glanced at the others, looking for reassurance that they were still in control. That glance didn't go unnoticed. She saw it, filed it away, adjusted her read of the room. This is where assumptions do the most damage, not when they're made, but when they collapse. People don't have a backup plan for being wrong. They don't know how to pivot because they never expected to need to. Their behavior becomes reactive, scattered, inconsistent. They tried to reassert dominance, but it came out forced. Louder didn't mean stronger anymore. The space they tried to claim felt unstable. Their confidence was built on a story that was no longer believable, and without that story, their actions lost coherence. She didn't expose them. She didn't call anything out. She let the collapse happen on its own. That restraint mattered. When assumptions fall apart publicly, people panic. When they fall apart internally, people unravel. They start questioning themselves mid-action, second-guessing instincts they were relying on just moments ago. They notice things they hadn't before. Her posture, her eyes, the way she tracked movement without seeming to look. Those details hadn't registered earlier because they didn't fit the narrative they were running. Now they stood out sharply, impossible to ignore. One of them softened their tone without realizing it. Another took a half step back. Small adjustments, but revealing. The balance had shifted, not because she changed what she was doing, but because they did. Their assumptions no longer gave them permission to push as hard as they had been. They were caught between two impulses: continue escalating to save face, or pull back before crossing into something they didn't fully understand. That hesitation created a gap. Gaps are dangerous when you don't know how to manage them. She felt the shift immediately. Training had taught her to recognize that moment when confidence drains out of a confrontation and uncertainty takes its place. It's the moment when people are most unpredictable, when pride clashes with self-preservation. They started asking questions without asking them. Who is she? Why isn't this working? What did we miss? Those questions didn't need answers to change their behavior. The doubt alone was enough. The collapse of their assumptions didn't empower her in an obvious way. It destabilized them. That distinction mattered. She wasn't suddenly in control because she asserted dominance. She was in control because the framework they were operating under no longer functioned. They tried to rewind the interaction mentally, looking for the mistake. There wasn't a single one. It was the assumption itself. Everything they'd built on top of it had been flawed from the start. Their aggression lost direction. Without certainty, it became scattered. Without belief in their read of her, they didn't know how far to go or when to stop. The confidence that had fueled them earlier had nowhere to land. She didn't rush this moment. She didn't capitalize on it theatrically. She let it settle, let the discomfort grow, let them sit with the realization that they didn't understand the situation nearly as well as they thought they did. The collapse wasn't visible to outsiders. To someone watching casually, nothing dramatic had changed. But internally, the confrontation had crossed a threshold. The power dynamic they'd assumed was gone, replaced by something unstable and unfamiliar. That's the danger of assumptions. They don't just misjudge others. They blind you to reality. When they finally break, they leave you exposed, uncertain, and unprepared to deal with what's actually in front of you, standing there calmly, unchanged, fully aware that the moment someone realizes they've been wrong all along is the moment the situation becomes unpredictable. Because people who lose their assumptions don't just lose confidence, they lose their sense of control, and once that happens, Every move they make is no longer grounded in certainty, but driven by confusion, pride, and the sudden awareness that they may have stepped into something far beyond what they were prepared to handle. Walking away didn't look like retreat. It looked like choice. That distinction mattered. She wasn't leaving because she was pushed out or overwhelmed. She was leaving because the situation no longer required her presence. Strength isn't always proven by standing your ground. Sometimes it's proven by knowing when the ground no longer needs you on it. They expected a final display, some sharp line, some dramatic move that would let them frame the story as a win or a loss. What they got instead was her disengaging without ceremony. No insults thrown back. No victory claimed. Just a quiet removal of herself from the equation. That unsettled them more than confrontation ever could. Walking away takes confidence. Not the kind that needs witnesses, but the kind that trusts itself without applause. She didn't need their acknowledgement to validate her strength. She didn't need to be remembered as dominant. She needed to remain intact, in control, and unaffected by their need for conflict. They were left standing in the aftermath of their own behavior, adrenaline still high, nowhere to direct it. That's the thing about walking away with intention. It denies others the closure they expect. It forces them to sit with what they brought into the situation without giving them anything in return. She carried herself differently as she left. Not tense, not rushed. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate. That calm exit sent a clearer message than any threat could have. It said she wasn't shaken. It said she hadn't been altered by the encounter. It said she was exactly the same person walking away as she had been walking in. Strength doesn't always escalate. Sometimes it de-escalates without apology. She didn't owe them an explanation. She didn't owe them a reaction. Walking away wasn't about them at all. It was about preserving her own standards. She didn't engage in battles that didn't align with her purpose. They might have told the story later in a way that saved face. People often do. But whatever version they shared, one detail would linger. She didn't need to prove anything. That detail has weight. It sticks. It creates doubt. Doubt about who actually held power in that moment. Walking away stronger means you don't carry the encounter with you longer than necessary. She didn't replay it for validation. She didn't need to justify her choices. She understood that strength isn't measured by how loudly you respond, but by how little the noise follows you afterward. She didn't walk away untouched. Awareness always leaves a mark, but she walked away unburdened. The situation didn't attach itself to her identity. It didn't define her. It was a moment, handled, closed, left behind. They stayed. She moved forward. That contrast mattered. Progress often looks quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply continues. Walking away stronger also means trusting your training enough to know you don't need to demonstrate it. She didn't need to remind herself of what she could do. She already knew. That knowledge stayed internal, solid, unchanged by whether anyone else ever discovered it. The loudest people often need the last word. She didn't. Silence followed her not because she was silenced, but because there was nothing left to say. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was resolution. Strength that isn't loud doesn't echo, but it endures. It shows up later, in how easily you breathe, how steadily you move, how little the encounter occupies your thoughts. She walked away carrying herself the same way she always did, grounded, aware, unhurried. They may have felt victorious for a moment simply because the conflict ended. That feeling would fade. What wouldn't fade was the unease. The sense that something didn't go the way it was supposed to. That they didn't get the reaction they expected. That the person they thought they could control chose not to engage on their terms. Walking away stronger isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about refusing to be defined by it. She didn't need to win in front of them. She needed to win within herself, by staying aligned with who she was and how she chose to move through the world. She didn't look back, not out of arrogance, but because there was nothing there for her anymore. The moment had passed. The lesson had already landed. She continued forward carrying no proof, no trophies, no visible signs of what she was capable of, just the quiet certainty that she didn't need to be louder to be stronger, didn't need to dominate to remain in control, and didn't need to stay to prove anything to people who were never entitled to her energy in the first place.